dia a todos, excelente sexta-feira, sejam muito bem-vindos ao Proformação. Eu sou Kátia Martins, professora, educadora, pesquisadora, e criei esse canal, como muitos de vocês já sabem, para que a gente tenha um espaço de interação, um espaço de troca, e que a gente consiga ampliar aí os nossos espaços de conversa, né? Hoje nós teremos uma fala muito interessante, uma conversa bastante acolhedora sobre linguagem, língua, pesquisa, letramentos e afeto. Espero que vocês curtam conosco esse momento que tem um caráter não tão formal, e eu espero que nesse meados aí de um final de semana longo, a gente possa interagir bastante por aqui. Convido o meu colega Kleber, do grupo GECAL, para vir aqui acompanhar. Opa, cadê o Kleber? Espera aí, só um minuto, Kleber. Aí, pronto. Seja muito bem-vindo, Kleber, ao Proformação. Vamos lá para a nossa próxima sexta de bate-papo.
Olá, Kátia, bom dia a você, bom dia a todos os colegas que estão nos acompanhando no YouTube agora, sejam todos muito bem-vindos, sejam todas muito bem-vindas. É com imenso prazer que a gente vai ter o nosso 13º colóquio voltado para a educação linguística crítica no Sul Global, e hoje nós vamos ter o imenso prazer de receber o nosso querido amigo, nosso querido colega e o grande apreciador, o professor Brian Morgan, que certamente irá contribuir muito, né, Kátia, para o nosso crescimento acadêmico profissional.
Claro que sim. Uhum.
E eu queria, em nome do GECAL, o Grupo de Estudos Críticos e Avançados em Linguagem, externar a nossa gratidão, viu, Kátia, pela parceria feita com o Proformação, para a gente justamente disseminar a nossa produção intelectual, para que a gente possa, justamente nessa pandemia, socializar os nossos feitos acadêmicos e possamos pensar em parcerias para a gente diminuir um pouco justamente as questões que nós temos na sociedade, que são questões muito caras para nós. E eu acho que nesse momento de pandemia, falar de afeto, falar de pós-memória, falar de duoethnografia, eu acho que é de suma importância.
Ensino, né?
Ensino, e certamente o professor Brian Morgan irá contribuir muito para nós nessa manhã. Então seja muito bem-vinda, Kátia, seja muito bem-vindo, queridos colegas do Brasil e de outros locais que irão nos acompanhar agora ou depois no nosso canal, e certamente teremos uma manhã bastante profícua de discussões acadêmicas voltadas para essa perspectiva.
E eu aproveito para convidar você que está nos assistindo agora a enviar esse link e convidar outros colegas para que possam aqui interagir conosco. Teremos um espaço para perguntas, então em algum momento você poderá enviar seus comentários, suas perguntas e interagir direto com o nosso convidado que está no Canadá e teve a delicadeza de nos ceder esse tempo de interação. Convido então a Neuda, que será a nossa colega aqui, mediadora desse debate. Olá, Neuda, seja bem-vinda. Mediadora desse debate, que irá interagir diretamente com o professor e diretamente com vocês também, que vão participar conosco aqui dessa manhã. Seja bem-vinda, Neuda.
Seja bem-vinda, Neuda.
Muito obrigada, querida Kátia, querido Kleber. É uma alegria estar aqui com vocês, né? E com as pessoas que estão nos assistindo. Bom dia a todas, todos que estão conosco nessa manhã aqui no Brasil. Boa tarde, boa noite a quem está nos assistindo de outras partes do planeta. Me sinto muito honrada por poder fazer a mediação desse colóquio nosso, por poder receber um convidado tão precioso, né, para os nossos estudos. Hoje o nosso colóquio tem como tema New Challenges and Opportunities for Critical Language Work, Exploring Affect, Postmemory and duoethnography. Antes de nós continuarmos, eu gostaria de convidar vocês a acessar os QR Codes que estão aqui na tela, para que vocês possam conhecer um pouco mais do trabalho que o Proformação e o GECAL, o UNB, têm realizado. A gente tem trabalhado com temas muito relevantes para a sociedade, como educação linguística crítica, formação de professores, internacionalização, letramentos, políticas linguísticas, né? Afeto, como nós vamos ver nessa manhã, distintas modalidades de pesquisa, pesquisa atual, memória. Então, usem os QR Codes, acessem os nossos canais, nos sigam, deixem o seu like, e acompanhem a nossa atividade e, principalmente, participem da nossa conversa, tá? A gente vai começar daqui a pouco com a fala do nosso convidado. Enquanto isso, vocês são muito bem-vindas, muito bem-vindos para participar no chat, ok? Para escrever seus comentários. Pois não?
Peço licença, porque agora nós vamos deixar você na sala. Eu e Kleber vamos ficar aqui no backstage, aqui atrás. Qualquer coisa você nos sinaliza, ok?
Muito bem, muito obrigada, Kátia, Kleber, obrigada pelo apoio. E hoje, our today's speaker is a distinguished emeritus professor that studies affect, postmemory, duoethnography, and how they can work as a key action for social development. Professor Brian Morgan, I'm going to talk just a little about all his accomplishments. Yeah, he completed his BA at York University, and it was combined honors in ethnomusicology and anthropology. Yeah, he's a musician as well. Yeah, as you can see for his BA, and also he has MAD and PhD at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto, where he belongs to and he's retired from. Yeah, and the publication activities and his primary research, they have been directed towards the intersections of language and identity, and the development of critical literacies and pedagogies in English language teaching, and also in formação de professores, yeah, in language teacher education. As you can see, Professor Morgan action in the academic area matches very much our interest here as GECAL and Proformação, yeah? And he has collaborated with us in Brazil since 2010. On various research projects and co-publications, in conference presentations. And he is also co-editor with Penny Cook and Ryuko Kubota. I believe you all know, or at least have heard of his partners in this critical language and literacy studies series for multilingual metas in the United Kingdom. And also he's a current board of trustee member for the Center for Applied Linguistics in Washington, D.C. And this very week, it's the second time Professor Brian Morgan is delivering a talk in Brazil. Yeah. So as we were talking behind the screens, it's a very Brazilian week for him. And so with all our gratitude for his kindness to accept our invitation, please receive Professor Brian Morgan.
Okay. Bom dia a todos e todas. Neude, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I'm really appreciative of this opportunity to get to speak to GESAL and all my Brazilian friends and colleagues. As you saw in the introduction, I've been just so fortunate since 2010 to have been able to share in different projects and to work and learn more about my own kind of teaching context from the experience of working with Brazilians and in Brazil. So I have to say it's probably the highlight of my career is all the opportunities to travel around and work with Brazilians. I kind of really missed the last couple of years of COVID and the pandemic. So it's been mostly just meeting on over computers, but you know, it's better than nothing. I sure miss out on all the wonderful experiences of in-person contact. But yeah, thank you so much. Now, I guess I should, if you could, I've put together a little bit of just an opening. Yeah, there's a title for today. So when I was first contacted, I was asked to provide some readings, which is kind of nice to give you a sense of what I've been working on. All of these are the last couple of years. I would say what they have in common is I'm moving more towards dialogic, conversational, collaborative work in applied linguistics. I think in many ways, it's a research approach that mirrors very much what I think is the unique aspect of language teaching and language teaching education, is thinking collectively of the prime importance of interpersonal relationships and the spaces that those relationships can be to either encourage or discourage growth of both linguistic, but even personal and collective development. So these three papers for me have in common the focus on dialogue. Duoethnography is more of a, I would say, well thought out, defined, and theorized approach to the kind of dialogue. And then, so I've included two papers on that, and we'll talk about that. The paper that Daniel and I, so I've been doing these kinds of dialogues since I'd say about 2009 with Vaidehi Ramanatha. And let's say implicitly, we tried to aspire to the kinds of detailed theoretical framework that Norris and his partners develop in a theorization duoethnography. So let's go to the next slide, Katja, if you could just, so you see the three articles. The very first one is a recent publication in Kaleidoscopio. And then at the same year is also with Anwar Ahmed, is a paper on postmemory. So, and then there was a really nice interview that Daniel has organized for the third paper. So the three of them. And I'm hoping to get a chance to get feedback from the audience. So let's go on to the next slide. So what I've tried to do from these papers is look at what would be the key concepts across them. Definitely the work of duoethnography, but also what comes across is I've become really interested in affect and emotion. So the first concept, how I see them intersecting in interesting ways, is the idea of, especially in a place like Canada and Toronto, where so many of my students have come to Toronto, let's say in not really in a voluntary way, but they've come to leave difficult parts of the world. They carry with them powerful, difficult memories. These memories are also very emotional. They become implicated in literacies in interesting ways. And in fact, what I found fascinating about this is in the article that I co-wrote with Anwar on postmemory, is that I started to see my own experience through the connection of duoethnography, the experience of my own multilingual literacy upbringing, how that also brought in feelings of emotions tied to texts, tied to the multiple meanings and the semiotics of text. So I found myself, as Anwar often talks about in his work on critical affective literacies, I find myself drawn to certain texts or elements of texts, and they bring back memories. And part of those memories are the memories that are of collective belonging, how we came to Canada, and then how that understanding helps me relate to students who also come to Canada with powerful memories of identity that preceded their own direct experience, but that affect them in very profound ways. So this, even when we get into areas of citizenship studies, and I've been very lucky to work on citizenship issues, particularly with Valkyria Montemor. We did a paper together on that, is how citizenship is so much tied to the way in which we relate these post memories of how we came to these new places, to the dominant discourses and, let's say, the oppositional discourses within the society in which education and language education and citizenship education converge. So certainly in Canada, in the last 5 years, there's been strong attention to and related to post-memory to issues of truth and reconciliation, the terrible treatment of Indigenous peoples in Canada, and that also comes out in the papers. This kind of process of truth and reconciliation has also been a prominent issue raised in countries like South Africa and Chile. I know that also Andrea Matos, I don't know if Andrea is here today, has done really important work on how the intergenerational experience of the dictatorship in Brazil, what effects it has on how next generations see their relationship to citizenship, to authority, and to democracy. So these are really important, I see, as dimensions of this. And Anwar and I talk about complicating factors of it. So in the midst of all this excitement about translanguaging, plurilingualism, translingual practices, we must also keep a mind on, for students, there can be underlying memory-related tensions around the using of the first language, and people like Aneta Pavlenko have written a lot about this. So we need to be aware that it's not students just maybe resisting the latest second language acquisitional insights or innovations, that there are profound historical and post-memory reasons why the or other languages are resisted or engaged with in fraught or difficult circumstances. So that was kind of like that. So let's go on to the next slide, Katja. So this is another key point that runs across at least two of these readings. And it's certainly been an area that's getting a lot of attention in applied linguistics, I'd say in the last 5 years, maybe even 10 years. I have to credit Sarah Benish, who wrote a fabulous book on emotions in language teaching and language teacher education. She's done 2 books. She has been really at the forefront of looking at and grounding affect theory in the context of applied linguistics, because and I've come to affect and emotion much later. And what do I appreciate about this, and also comes in the paper, is that some of the theory on affect can be very, very difficult. And to take that theory and ground it in a field internal way to make it relevant to language teaching is an accomplishment, an important accomplishment, and Sarah Benish has done that. And so this affective turn in education is really interesting, because for me, it also ties into earlier work that I've done that has been very much involved in identity. And we can maybe talk about that later. So areas of affect here can become, and emotion often emerge in the context of teaching, and we need to be thinking about it. But also, we also need to think about how they can be mobilized in the service of the kinds of critical literacies and critical pedagogies and socially oriented and social justice initiatives, that affect is a powerful, motivating force for doing good. But it also, as we increasingly see in our politics, it can be a very powerful, motivating source of disruption and opposition. And so we need to get a better grasp on it, especially if we're in programs that I've been in, where the content of the courses are issues of citizenship. To what extent are the ways in which we teach rhetoric, persuasion, being heard, being taken seriously? To what extent do the ways in which we prepare students as skillful orators, as skillful writers, as rhetoric citizens, are the ways we do that really suitable for the kind of increasing circulation of emotional texts and visual and semiotic texts that are no longer based on traditional evidence-based argumentation? So in many ways, I think our universities are geared towards affect and an emotion, at least in the social sciences, that don't match what's going on in our broader society. And that's something to consider when we teach citizenship. In the second bullet point there, one of the challenges that you come up against is that there really are different notions of what affect is. So for example, I've been very interested in Deleuze and Guattari's work, and Brian Masumi, who was the translator. His notion of affect is completely different. Affect is separate from emotion. So this is an interesting thing to consider. He sees affect. So there's different schools of what affect means. The Masumi school is that it is non-representational, that is prior, that emotion is the containment, the semiotic encoding qualifies and contains the kind of intensity that affect has. As we talk about in the article with Anwar and Huberval Maciel, we go over the different ones. There's, like, you could say there's three models of, and there's probably more, of affect as some kind of primordial state, the Masumi idea, that exists, this intensity. There's another one that looks at it as completely socially, that we gain our emotional fiber, our emotional framework is socially acquired. Then the third one that we're very interested in, and Sarah Benish's work has kind of raised it, is that it is neither something that lies innately within us, nor is it socially acquired. That in fact, Sarah talks about a kind of Sarah Benish and Sarah Ahmed, she got it from Sarah Ahmed, this idea of neither inside out nor outside in, that it is a kind of enactment, a kind of enabled through contact with others. So the idea of that it becomes emergent rather than unfolded. So this idea that relationships, the way in which people come in contact with each other, are key. And I think for education, that's the key thing, because we are in these contexts of interpersonal, intercultural, complex interaction, lots of the inter prefix there. And these are the spaces in which the affect and emotion become highly relevant to what is learned and what is not learned. And another person I should mention here who was a huge influence on my career was Jim Cummins. And he's talked about this for a long time, but at the core of language learning is this idea of, he calls the interpersonal spaces, which again would be similar because these interpersonal spaces are also very much emotion laden. So the idea of the spaces that teachers create with their students interpersonally can lead to collaborative relations of power or alternatively, coercive relations of power. So again, this kind of affect emerging, emotion emerging in the relationships that you have. And I would pose this question for all of us to think about. I find, looking back on a 20-year career of teaching, and then just looking over my life of the experience of being educated and being in educational settings, often what I remember most about a teacher is not a specific lesson, but the quality of the relationship that I've had with that person. And maybe you have had that. So I don't remember the specific day-to-day curricular linear accumulation of this lesson on this day, I'll learn this. I remember a kind of overall sense of values and feelings of mentorship, and these kinds of things I find almost they exist on a scale, a time scale, a chronotope, if we use the Vactinian idea of learning, and things that I see are life learning lessons or meta lessons that exceed the short 10-week or 12-week formalized curriculum that universities measure. So this is, again, an interesting thing, is that why affect is a difficult thing to grasp is the existing structures of education do not readily recognize the timescales and the quality of the content or the quality of the experience that is highly emotional. Oh, Valkyria says hi. Great to see you, Valkyria. Yeah, so this has been one of the things that I've been fascinated about, is the structure of schooling. To what extent does it not reflect or anticipate the quality of learning that affect and emotion and all kind of identity transforming work exists in? And so this is an interesting change or interesting challenge that affect and emotion brings to the work. So the very last on the bottom, I don't know if, Katya, can you raise it up a tiny bit? Maybe, oh, sorry. If you could just go back, or is that it? I wanted to see if we could see Anwar Ahmed's 4 key points on. There we are. So critical affective literacies, examining why we feel what we feel. He's got 4 key. I think this is a brilliant article. It's by Anwar. He was writing using an alternative name, Anwar Rudin, in 2016 in Discourse. He gives 4 key. Let me see if I can read them to you. Yeah. So he has 4 key points that define a critical affective literacy, or literacies, examining why we feel what we feel, making that the focus of what's attracted us or repelled us from certain objects, texts, and spaces and places and memories, striving to enter a relation of affective equivalence, and so this almost Levinasian relationship, or you can even say Hancher's work. So being in a sense of being open to otherness and sensitive to the affective challenges or intersections involved. Now, this is number 3, is this interrogating the production and circulation of objects of emotion in everyday politics, which I think is critical for the kinds of political environments we live in now. And his 4th point is focusing on the performativity of emotions to achieving social justice, which is very much related to the 3rd. So I highly recommend this article. We certainly cover it in some of the articles I sent you. Okay, so thanks, Katya. Could you move on to then the next slide? Okay. So duoethnography, as I was mentioning earlier, to me is fascinating in that it It poses challenges for participants, and the challenges themselves, the more we were doing it, the challenges themselves go to the heart of affective and emotional issues. So duoethnography really asks us to build trust, to take risks, to exchange ideas with dialogue partners in a non-hierarchical basis. So if it's with a student or with a senior colleague or junior colleague or with a participant, it asks us to do that. It asks us to be accountable in terms of our voices are there in the text. It places an interesting relationship to the reader. So let me see. I guess the bottom of this is cut off as well too. So what it does with the reader, unlike other kinds of texts, is that where most texts, and as we all know, there's pressure to, when you send texts out for publication, there's always the pressure to trumpet this great accomplishment, this uniqueness. And in fact, every call for paper says, show us the innovation of your paper. What have you accomplished? Duoethnography challenges to say that the final ultimate results, the value of the work resides in the reader. That the value of the duoethnography is to bring the different perspectives together on a common phenomenon. And the juxtaposition of those may show tensions and differences. But by doing that, what you do is you illuminate how different groups, different identity groups experience what may be perceived as a common phenomenon. So in a sense, it's a way of illuminating, and this is the aspiration of duoethnography, illuminating the differences around a common phenomenon. And that could be a curriculum, it could be a policy. It could be a hiring policy. It could be something going on in the community. So particularly in settings of diversity, it is a very valuable tool. And again, as Norris and Sawyer say, what they aspire to, this is the ideal, it is a research method and a pedagogy. And I have a few quotes there. So duoethnographers interpret their dialogically created meanings and seek critical tension, insights, and new perspectives, which stem in part from the explicit dialogical focus. So yeah, so that's the challenge to do that. And in the next line, in contrast to autoethnography, duoethnography locates the researcher differently. It is ultimately not about the self. So this is an interesting tension. Certainly, there are people working in autoethnography that do look at it as, I've seen the term collaborative autoethnography, which is probably very similar. So the idea is not to know more about the self, but to take that focus of things that you maybe didn't even think about the self. And this comes out in the papers that I've shared with you, that take experiences, see them in a new light, and then trace that back to the sources of curricula, policy, teaching, or social life that they originate from. Okay, and I think there was one more quote. Let's see if I can find it. Yes. So the last one at the bottom of that page, duoethnography requires the courage to make oneself vulnerable in the presence of another in a future audience. Okay. So one other thing about duoethnography I want to just briefly mention is that especially around the issue of coloniality, decolonial thinking, the process of generating a duoethnography, at least in the ones I've worked in, is very much an oral beginning. It tries to use oralcy. So often I will get together with collaborators, and we will do Zoom recordings. We'll record them. We'll have conversations. We'll try to enact what we say in the article, this idea of thinking together thinking collaboratively, challenging each other, talking about something. So the oral dimension, I think, is critical, because there's an interesting challenge for academics. In a sense, we are rewarded, our careers, our identities, are acknowledged usually through what we publish. And we are kind of compelled to write about and talk about them in ways that are perhaps not really reflective of the essence, I think, of the interpersonal relationships of teaching. So maybe in other disciplines, let's say like a philosophy or other theoretical fields, where the writing of texts is the key kind of knowledge mobilization, I find that in a sense, for our fields of language teacher education, language teaching, the attempts to reproduce or to create valuable knowledge for our field, the writing of texts in very dense theoretical language, which is necessary to get published, and in many ways fails to, in a sense, almost kinds of, if I would say, recolonizes knowledge and makes it inaccessible for those who need to use it. So it's an aspiration, but I find the process of duoethnography, the collaboration, the oral nature of it, where the conversational and oral nature of the preparation of the text and the negotiation of the final text, in a sense, is a way of reintroducing a more collaborative, oral-oriented form of knowledge mobilization. So, I mean, I'm hoping that's something we can talk about. Okay, let's go down. Let's see what, okay. This is just a quick outline of how I came to some of the materials, how I came to the experience of the post-memory work. So the post-memory work, it came out of the semiotics and trans-semiotics of culture jamming that I've talked about before in Brazil. And what I started to find is that in this assignment, so you'll see on the left, this is a fake advertisement, or they would call it a subvertisement or parody text. And one day I was just completely stunned when a student, for an assignment on comparing advertising and language of advertising persuasion, sent this in. And the student thought it was a real ad. And suddenly I got, oh my God, why would the student think that? A, but B, what kind of prior knowledge and experiences do students need? Because this is a kind of rhetoric, and often this kind of meme work and parody work is very much part of the political landscape. We don't have a marketplace of ideas as much of the marketplace of sign in civic engagement and deliberation. So this, and I've talked about this a lot at conferences in Brazil, but this was the initial kernel of thought from a teaching perspective of post-memory, and I can tell you why. So I started to ask students more and more, how did this image, how does it work as what Kylie Lasser would call meme warfare, or the production of these kinds of parody texts? But also I started asking people more and more, how did the text make you feel? Bringing in a more explicit, going back to Anwar, how do these texts attract you or repel you? And then bringing in principal tools of analysis, which I've always borrowed from visual grammars, multimodality, and the pioneering work of Crescent Van Leuven, and its basis, its grounding in the meta-language of social semiotics and Hallidayan social semiotics. So this leads to the next slide. Katja, if you can show it to me. Yeah, so this fascinated me, were these kinds of signs in Toronto. So underneath, I started to bring in more of these kinds of elements that it integrated post-memory, so multilingual landscapes. Toronto is probably one of the most multilingual, multicultural, multiracial cities in the world. It's up there with London, New York. And these are the kinds of things you see in and around Toronto. The sign on the left was actually a sign at a political rally in front of our provincial government offices. So what's fascinating about that is you can see the rhetoric. It's multimodal. You see the Canadian flag with the Soviet cross and symbol. You see Joseph Stalin on the left shaking hands with who was the leader of our NDP, which would be maybe the equivalent of the Workers' Party in Brazil. So fascinating for me was the digraphia. If you look down at Canada's New Democrats, you will see the insertion of Cyrillic alphabet. Now, many languages have Cyrillic. It's used in Serbia, Bulgarian, Russian, but Ukrainian. So this is the distributed addressivity. So Toronto is one of the largest diasporic Ukrainian communities in Canada or in the world. And in fact, my family came to Canada in the 1890s as Ukrainian farmers, my mother's family. And so when you see that sign, there's multiple meanings going on. And for someone from Ukraine, it's also the post-memory of the Holodomor, which was Stalin's forced man-made famine where millions of Ukrainians died because of the policies of the government, forced agricultural collective. So people looking at this sign, different groups will be addressed differently. For someone with that experience of post-memory, that sign is going to mean different things. The sign on the right was also a very unpopular politician in Toronto. And again, the colors, the star, the integration of Russian Cyrillic or Cyrillic orthography, again, it's having denotation of the meanings. But you also have the indexicality. So how the sign will point to other aspects, contiguous aspects in the text, but then also the post-memory, how that it'll trigger emotions for certain people, certain groups. So you can see these features of digraphia, distributed addressivity, post-memory. So let's go to the last image, which the next one, Katja, which is really for me, because one side of my family came from the Ukraine, the other side of my family, Eastern European Jews that came over in the 1920s and not under very happy circumstances. That sign, Bagel World. So what struck me about it is my reaction to it. So what you have here is you have at the level of denotation, and I was really influenced by a fabulous article on the Semiotics of Multilingualism by Dejan Ivkovic. I think it's in the journal of Semiotica. So he talks exactly about this kind of digraphia and its effects. So when anyone looks at it, they may just say, oh, Bagel World is a place that sells bagels. But when I look at it, I right away pick up on the suggestion or implication of the higher second order indexicality, that these are approximating Hebrew characters or orthography. That what looks like a W is actually in Hebrew the shin. What looks like a mem suggests the D. So when someone who had my experience of going to Hebrew school as a young child, there's many things that happen. Again, it's the emotion of why collectively Jews have come to Canada. It's also the emotion in the indexicality is that adds a level of authenticity. This must be an authentic bagel place because they've made the sign. But there was another level that's fascinating, and it ties in with things that we've talked about on panels in Brazil, is that part of the reason this sign triggers an affective experience in me was the nature of the literacy I was exposed to as a young boy. And it's I don't think you can see the bottom of this, but it refers to, let me see if I can. It refers to what Rosowski calls as devotional literacies for, at the bottom of that page, devotional literacies for my ethnic minority communities. So devotional literacies feature a high degree of collective rote learning, memorization, oral recitation in groups. Rosowski talks about this as not just becoming literate, but it is as an identity binding experience, particularly for minority faith communities. So we often look at things like rote learning and memorization, those kinds of literacies, and they are often neoconservative, authoritarian ways to depoliticize or take away from the social practice of letramentos, instead making it just strictly a cognitive. But there's another dimension that gets lost here, is that this kind of phonics and rote learning is also a form of identity maintenance. And in some ways, as Rosowski talks about, for minority faith communities, faith identity communities, they become even intensified. And that was my experience, is that the literacy practices of devotional literacies were probably even more enhanced and emphasized, given that and rightly so, that the society was gradually assimilating and losing that kind of post-memory reason for why we're here. So interesting, another dimension of this. So that got me thinking more and more about, as Anwar's work on critical affective literacies talks about, this relationship of what attracts us to signs. How is the sign working, the text, multimodally, affectively, at many levels? How it's distributed, speaking to different audiences at the same time, different viewers and readers. And also fascinated by what is the for us as literacy teachers, what is the unit of analysis here? It is not just the signs of the text, it is the temporary alignment or articulation of the viewer's experience as it aligns or sticks to. I mean, I think Sarah Ahmed talks about sticky objects, as it sticks to the text or is repelled by the text. So these are interesting things. And of course, Deleuze and Guattari's work on assemblages fits in very nicely here, because the unit of analysis now, as you can see, is both the text as semiotic activity, but also as affective, emotional. It creates or stimulates intensities of feeling, but not for everyone. And so this is an interesting challenge for, and not over the same time scales of meaning making activity. And again, it's the, let's say, the non-material, not as Shelmsleb would say, the plane of expression and the plane of content do not reside in the text alone. You can see the complexity of analysis, including the experiences of and the post memories of different participants differently positioned on the text. So these are the things that have evolved for me in recent work. And it's been a real treat getting to work with Brazilians on this work. I should also mention Cláudia Rocha and Huberval got to do a fabulous paper on literacies in times of crisis. And again, so much of the politics today is not based on rational evidence-based reasoning. It's being driven by emotion, and emotion being mobilized by texts and signs. people in contact. And so the question I pose for audiences is, to what extent are we not preparing or are preparing students to participate in these new realignments of civic participation and citizenship? Okay, so I think I should stop there. Neuda, what do you think? That's probably enough, right? I'd love to hear from you. Oh, I can't hear you, Neuda. There we are.
We could be here the whole day listening to you, Brian.
Oh, but I warn you against that.
All right, but what precious experiences, what precious thoughts you brought to us. We do appreciate that.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you can stop now, and then we have more time, yeah, to engage our audience and to interact with you. But we are going to ask you questions and want to hear more from you. We are going to explore, seize the opportunity to listen to you a lot. I'd like to thank again our audience, you people who attending this moment, our colloquium here. Thank you from all over the world, from wherever you are. And I'd like to tell our audience that my master's and my doctorate studies, they are in affect. I am an English literature professor, and then I've studied affect and emotions in the field of foreign literature, or as we call nowadays, additional literature. So you can imagine my pleasure in listening to Brian here this morning. And you see, the papers he's brought, they are highly recommendable. And our group, GECOL, has had the pleasure of reading these papers in advance. Yeah, Brian. So in a minute, we are going to show some questions to you. These papers, they are part of the massive academic production of Professor Brian Morgan. And he has been awarded by many international associations. And it's not only because of that, but mainly because the power of the significance of his ideas, as you could see now. Yeah, listening to you, Brian, has been an immensely pleasure and quite worthy to all of us. Yeah? And let me tell you something that is quite personal, yeah, but the very fact that you have chosen to research affect, postmemory, duoethnography, yeah, collaborative learning, as you mentioned in your talk, critical affective literacies in general. Yeah, you delve deeply into this holistic view of mankind and into this opening of the self to itself and others. So that shows to us the captivating, the caring person you are, and we really thank you for your words. Okay, and so I'm going to show to you and to ask you, showing to our audience, the questions our group has written before, after reading the papers you've talked about here. So the first one: how did this partnership with Brazil start? And since then, that is a very Brazilian curiosity, yeah? Since then, what have you observed from a critical affect literacy perspective about the two contexts, Canada and Brazil, especially considering the different political, economic, and social aspects?
Yeah, so I just, it's like, I think I mentioned it, one of the happiest things that happened to me in terms of career and experience was that Lynn Mario and Valkyria invited me to an USPE, the second seminar of the Novos Letramentos group. And I think that was 2010 or 11. And that was fantastic. What an exciting group of colleagues. It's so interesting to reflect now that it's similar to the effect OISE has had, that USPE became like this node of knowledge mobilization. And you almost have now, so you had this center of intense thinking and generation of knowledge. And then you had the graduates move on and create places of critical work and literacy throughout the country. And then now you see their students are now, so you almost see like a second, third generation of USPE. And it's fascinating because I've seen the same thing happen at my graduate school, OISE. And it's so interesting to see how knowledge does move and ideas move. And so you see something with OISE where we're now at where I worked, almost 3/4 of any new hires came out of OISE. And then their students are now going on. So it's interesting to see how collectively knowledge becomes generated, certain orientations, and how, and I think Penn State in the United States is very similar, and that they become important, innovative sites. I mean, one of the strengths of that, because these are also, there's the affective dimension of that, is we become deeply invested in our work, sometime, unfortunately, to the exclusion of points of view that disagree with us. So this is one of the challenges of the reproduction and the migration of powerful, affectively engaging perspectives on literacy, is that still maintaining the humility to be open to alternatives can be a challenge, especially when you've had so much of your career invested in the stature of your work. So those are interesting things, I'd have to say. So I start to appreciate that the aspect of the almost like the rhizomatic, the migratory nature of starting in a place, the roots of a movement of thinking about text and how it moves into certain areas. And I have to say, one of the reasons it's been so vibrant is the literacies groups in Brazil have always been so open to bringing in, to collaborate and to have dialogue with people from other parts of the world, like myself. I mean, that's been fabulous. Yeah, so Andrea just said collaboration and affect go hand in hand. Completely right. Absolutely. And so I was so lucky to have that opportunity. And I would say one of the things I notice is well, this is interesting because also Katja is now in the reverse of this, where she's come from Jekau and she's at York. So it's a very interesting and important kind of understanding this idea. And so it really underpins this idea of a transnational approach to literacies. The more I work with Brazilians, the more I start to see things I didn't recognize, gaps and, let's say, emphases in what goes on in Canada. So that's been really interesting.
It is indeed. And you see, our historical background, we all have different experiences, and the way we put them together, I think that's very enriching to our field of language teaching, literature teaching. You've received here comment by Andrea Matos. Yeah, we have some of your followers and partners here watching.
Collaborators.
Yeah. We have Valkyria Montemor, Beatriz Gama Rodrigues. We thank you for being here with us. Yeah, our questions from the group, they are quite curious. Something about how you came to form this profile. Yeah, so we move to question 2. Katja, please. And Brian, this one is about your academic journey and duoethnography. Yeah, so how did your journey led to your interest in duoethnography? Yeah. I found that quite interesting. I myself, because I want to know, I really want to know the steps you follow to choose this modality.
Yeah. So I credit Vaidehi Ramanathan in 2008 or 2009 was the first person who suggested, why don't we try to do a text dialogically? So instead of saying, instead of mapping out how the text would look, we decided that we would follow a explicitly dialogic process, that we would wait to see what our co-author partner had to say about something, and then we would proceed from there. So instead of mapping out, here's what the paper's going to look like in a very kind of predictive way, let's see where the paper will take us. Let's discuss it. Now, so I did a couple of those with Vaidehi, and then I've done others like that. I did one with Andrea. I'm trying to, and Valkyria, and then, but what happened, and one with Christian Chun, is that suddenly I read the Norris and Sawyer work, and it was fascinating because they had not only done this. So we would talk about people that we admired, like Levinas, the ethics of Levinasian dialogue, where you have to suspend your prior, or attempt to suspend your prior beliefs, even really important ones, in conversation and dialogue. But Norris and Sawyer had really elaborated the essence of this, what they call both a methodology and a pedagogy, because it's not just documenting what's there, it's a movement of change of self. So that was how I became interested in it. But the other reason, there's another reason I've been really fascinated about it, is I talked about this with Daniel in our paper, and I've talked about this in other papers, is I feel that transdisciplinary work has been very one-sided. This comes up in a few papers, that it tends to be language teachers reading philosophy, reading decolonial studies, reading cultural studies, reading literary studies, but they never read anything about our fields. So you rarely see someone in philosophy reading Valkyria, sorry. You'll rarely see them reading about, and I give the anecdote of, in one of the papers, of how in a peace studies conference, Stephanie Vandrick and I wrote a paper on what does second language teaching bring to the table. So we're at a peace studies conference, and the whole paper said these are unique aspects about our discipline that dialogically would be very useful for people in peace studies, the nature of the field, particularly the way we receive and construct texts. So the meta languages and the intercultural. Anyway, so at our presentation, nobody came, or I think there was one other applied linguist. They're going, well, what do we care about language teaching? What do they know? So I think there's a little bit of self-marginalization in the field because universities treat language teaching very poorly. In my university, it's like you want to get, we're under-resourced. Many of the new hires are just teaching stream because the university doesn't see any value. Whittleson knew about this years ago. He talked about linguistics applied. You have other more prestigious disciplines, especially the STEM ones that make money. And so what attracted me about duoethnography is, in a sense, as I said earlier, it tries to, I think, replicate what is the essence of knowledge mobilization in language teaching and language teacher education, is interpersonal relationships, is collaborative learning, collective learning. Many of the disciplines, you work in a very insular way in things like philosophy, where most of the publications are done individually. They deal with concepts, and as Deleuze and Guattari said in What is Philosophy? Concepts don't have to cohere. Concepts can be moving around, and in a sense they should. But the essence of education is actually coherence, the unification at the point of learning. The lesson may be learned later, as I said. The actual essence of the lesson may be learned later, tensions could come up, but this kind of contact as the essence of generating knowledge is something that duoethnography aspires to. It doesn't always work. It takes a lot of willingness to put trust in your collaborators. You have to trust them. You have to be willing to be vulnerable. That, as I said in one of the texts, that you come across looking really embarrassingly naive or embarrassingly too full of yourself. That's always a possibility. So you have to put trust in the way the text unfolds. You have to trust in what your collaborators say, and you have to be willing to suspend things that you thought were the truth about your work. So yeah, so I like it. It reminds me of the kinds of things I love about teaching, that interaction. And if I have to say what's unique about our field as opposed to other disciplines, if we're genuinely interested in transdisciplinary thought, is that we also bring this expertise to duoethnography of our understanding of meaning making in texts that even duoethnography, which came out of education, doesn't appreciate. So we are really sensitive to how linguistically and multimodally, how we construct texts that build rapport, that allow us to be taken seriously and sincerely by our participants. So we have that extra awareness of the semiotics, the text building properties that other disciplines don't have. So if we're going to have transdisciplinary thought, it needs to be reciprocated. So we need other disciplines to read our work, and so we can have that bounce back to us. And so I think duoethnography in a way imitates that, or attempts to, not always successfully. Okay.
I loved your questioning, Brian, of how transdisciplinarity really is. Yeah. And the situation we talked about in our field, being under-resourced, this situation resonates a lot here in Brazil. And we, in our group, we are quite willing to experience duoethnography and to see. I do hope for these, feedback from other fields, or for this interest from other fields. As a literature professor, I have to deal with all these fields: philosophy, economy, politics, and then I've seen what you have just said quite often. Yeah, it's just a one hand interest. We do need this bidirectional, let's say this bidirectionality, yeah, in the research. We are willing to try. We are still beginning yet understanding duoethnography, but that seems something quite appealing to us. Thank you very much for sharing that. Our next question, Katja, please. It's just something very precious to our group, which is the decolonial study. So could you please enlighten us on a possible relationship between duoethnography and decoloniality? You have already, pinpointed that, but can you please elaborate on that?
Yeah. So I was thinking more about this recently. So it goes again to this issue of orality or oralcy that I find fascinating. So I have to give you a little personal story that happened about 2 or 3 years ago. My mother passed away in 2016, and she had a book in process, but it was in rough process. She was an archaeologist working specifically with the indigenous peoples of the plains of Western Canada, where I grew up. And her thesis was fascinating. It looked at, even with the threat of the fur trade encroaching, European colonial fur trade encroaching on the prairies, why and enticing, if you wanted to get goods, European goods, and you were indigenous, you had to bring in furs. Why was it the group on the plains refused to hunt beaver, which was the most important fur the Hudson's Bay Company and the French and European colonizers. Well, the interesting thing was my mom's thesis elaborately detailed how they had a 1,000-year-old model of, or a method of water preservation in a part of the world that's very, very dry. And so the beaver produce dams that pool water on streams and rivers. And these streams of pools of water would attract their main source of survival, which was buffalo, bison, that were used for meat, for robes, for all sorts of things. So this was fascinating, an incredible, elaborate understanding. My mom's book, like understanding of the whole ecosystem, how these were pedestrian peoples before the horse moved around. Anyway, what was so fascinating for me, because I spent a couple years working on her book, and it was finally published last year, editing it. I had to read a lot of stuff in archaeology, speaking of going outside your discipline. So the fascinating thing for me from the issue of coloniality and decoloniality is, as the book, this is before my mom had passed away in 2016, the publisher, the University of Regina Press, was very, very interested in and expected that the book would have to reflect new Indigenous publications, decolonial ways of writing about and with Indigenous peoples. So it was fascinating, because this was after my mom's time. This kind of coloniality was still embedded in very much in archaeological studies and anthropology. So my mom was working, and what the terms that struck me that were so much just enmeshed in archaeology was this idea of prehistory. Prehistory then was the assumption that if you didn't encode in orthography, you don't have knowledge. You just accidentally stumble around. So there was no sense of understanding that this offensive term prehistory doesn't recognize the ability of conveying knowledge through oral traditions, and the ways in which oral traditions might even evolve, or how they're transmitted semiotically, with what aspects, maybe recitation. What are the ways in which these texts were done? There was also a very interesting term in the book I had to work with, which was, so there was a prehistory, proto-history, how a different, because this was really at the heart of my mom's book, is that different groups of Indigenous peoples were directly in contact with European traders, others were not. So it was fascinating to think about how coloniality and how the discipline of archaeology for so long didn't understand and belittled the knowledge, the expertise, and in my mom's book, it's expertise that exceeds some of the stupid things we do now in those parts of the world in terms of management of the environment and the ecological system. So what was fascinating is thinking about, okay, prehistory. So of course in the book we said pre-contact, and then we started to see, just the value of this kind of knowledge again. But at the source of it again was thinking about oral traditions, pre-alphabeticization, this Eurocentric idea that alphabetic writing was the most advanced form of writing. It reflects the most advanced form of civilization. It's on a Darwinian continuum where oral literacies were the weakest form. Pictographic, ideographic, syllabic writing were slightly a little bit better on this linear. And then, of course, alphabetic writing is the essence of a civilized, rational, intelligent society. So again, so what fascinated me is that how are we producing knowledge? Duoethnography allows for, and I was saying in the preparation of text, it encourages more of this kind of oral mobilization. Again, when I do it, I've got all sorts of recordings of us talking about the text and then working with the text. And new technologies also, we talk about how the new technologies of for working with a Google Doc allows you to have marginal conversations. You know, you can say, "Oh, I like this what you said, but don't you think this?" And so this whole kind of interactivity, including oral texts, including conversations, to me reminds me of a more kind of decolonial. I mean, I always worry. Okay, so I was going to say also. When a term becomes fashionable, it sometimes gets overextended. So we went through this with neoliberalism. Everything was neoliberal. Gosh, and you can go, and then so you worry that some of these terms become stretched to explain so much that in fact loses its most rigorous and productive forms of application. Anyway, so I will just say this, that I find a lot of the texts that talk about decoloniality are written in a way that to me feel like a kind of recolonization of the mind. They're inaccessible. But not, I would say they're inaccessible for my bias and what I see are the key dimensions of language teaching and the people for whom that knowledge is to be mobilized and applied. So other disciplines, fine, but I think this other thing of non-reciprocated disciplinary thought is part of this here. So duoethnography does that. Plus, the other thing is by making voices transparent. We mentioned this in one of our papers. There's real pressure for junior colleagues to defer to senior colleagues. And it's not because a senior colleague imposes that. So the transparency of voices and the expectation that we don't have to agree, that the ultimate value of the text will reside in the reader, takes away what is this kind of triumphal assumption of the text. Because all journalists will say, show us why this, and reviewers will say, oh, this isn't innovative. What is it? What is the production of this notion, this perception of an innovative work often requires a kind of conformity to consensus, that we all agree, and then when it comes to like reaching consensus, often it's the senior prestigious career established scholar that sets the terms for that. Not always, you know, you can have really great, generous colleagues like my Brazilian scholars because I've seen them interact with their students, that they would never do that. But there is this pressure, and it's really bad in some fields in Canada where students will just attach their professor's name to a publication. And then you're going, why? So it's dubious ethics, but in some fields, the student will say, because I learned this from you, you get to participate in this publication. And so it's things like that. So there's these aspects that I see. Now, I'd be curious to see if the viewers or readers see any others. But so that personal experience of working on my mom's book really got me thinking about this incredible wisdom that her research had brought up, environmental wisdom, that had never been taught to me. I grew up on the plains. We never learned any of this, nothing about this. They were invisible in our history books. But to see this in my mom's work, and then to see that the terms of references were so colonial, this idea in archaeology of prehistory, proto-history, all based on some kind of orthographic encoding, that what happened before, how in the world did they ever transmit knowledge? They never thought about it. They never thought of the wisdom of that, or the textual dexterity and nimbleness and the way in which over millennia, this kind of knowledge and experience and stories of how we got here would be conveyed. So this kind of richness of the oral tradition was just ignored or just trivialized in just these categories of prehistory. So, and getting to work with these new publishing norms where you have to change and rethink how you talk about or with Indigenous communities was great experience for me. And I was so happy to see my mom's book come out. So that's the other thing.
Yeah, congratulations on that. I want to read the book. I felt very interested now in reading about prehistory, proto-history, and oral traditions. By the way, my sympathies for your mother's passing, and I think that was for you. That was long ago, but the inheritance, the legacy is there. Yeah, very present.
Yeah, I also forgot to mention, who really inspired me about this also is thinking about Lynn Mario's work in the Kashinawa multimodality, which was, I'm sure most of the listeners have seen that, but that was also how it was evolving in certain ways, again, in very fascinating ways. So his understanding of the multimodality of those anaconda patterns and in contact, again, so a very interesting, sophisticated understanding of the ways in which literacies come in contact and the values of them, which again gets lost in the archaeology tradition and many other Eurocentric disciplines.
That's great. So, Lynn, when you were watching this later, our hug to you, our dear Lynn Mario. Okay, I feel very happy to see this resonating. Our experiences being exchanged this way. And then we are talking about another Brazilian in our fourth question, Brian. It's when we talk about being critical in Brazil, the first name that comes to mind is Paulo Freire, who has also talked about the importance of affect in the teaching and learning process. In his book, Pedagogy of Autonomy, Freire emphasized the importance of understanding the value of feelings, emotions, desire, insecurity, to be overcome by security in the education of the educator. Yeah. So the question for you is, was the critical affective literacy concept in any way intersected by Freire's thinking?
Yes, but then the question is of which Freire are we talking about? Gosh, I'm really not the one to be talking about this. The person who wrote this question, they should answer that for me. I regret to say I haven't read the Pedagogy of Autonomy. I've only read a few things people say about it, but I haven't read the whole book. This is, I mean, I'd be fascinated to talk to one of the audience members. This idea, the value of feelings to be overcome by security. Now, so that's really interesting. The definition of security. Now we're overlapping in debates about modernity and postmodernity, and so that's a fascinating that we could be here all day. Is the security of modernity the same as the security of postmodernity and a post-colonial and decolonial reality of the world? I would say that these are different notions of security.
Yeah.
And those more familiar with the later Freire, did he really engage with a reconsideration of what security is? So definitely affective literacy would say that security is not merely represented by material acquisition, that there's also things of being accepted, being respected, being valued for who you are, being valued for your identity on the terms of which you constructed it. And so when Anwar talks about affective equivalence, this goes to the core of it. Yeah. So the affective equivalence is, will you be accepted? Will your needs, your emotional and your material insecurities be overcome by recognition on the terms as you define them of who you are. Yeah, we
Yeah.
can write it. But again, I'd rather hear from some of my Brazilian colleagues on this one. Good question. I wonder who sent this one too.
You did great.
Okay.
Wonderful, yeah. You see, even if you haven't been over the pages, but this idea of having teacher development connected to base concepts of autonomy, or students' autonomy, mainly like
Yeah.
personal responsibility, self-esteem, self-awareness, self-determination, and being at the center of the process, focusing on students. So you did wonderfully. Congrats.
Yeah. So there were a few, I remember in a few articles, I was talking about English for self-defense. So in some way,
Yeah, perfect.
so that's probably a
Yeah.
deeper form of autonomy, but an important one.
Indeed. So let's move on to question 5. This is a question that is quite precious to me, Brian, because the question is, how can we act locally in order to try to break the taboos related to emotion in the traditional academic and educational environment? Because we still have this idea that research on affect or emotions is a sort of, under research or second valued, really undervalued, something like this is just for women. We have these connections and worse, very emotional women. Yeah. So there is once I even heard this idea of, are you from Cancer? The sign, the zodiac sign. Yeah. Are you from Cancer? And yes, I am. But so please, how can we face these taboos related to affect in language in the academy?
Yeah, well, I think there's within the academic environment is making several things, making emotion part of the content, the explicit content. Those 4 principles that Anwar talks about in A Critical Affective Literacy, where you actually give students tools to understand how emotion is being provoked or enabled, and how it's being performed. Understand how we are drawn or repelled from certain things. So making emotion part of the rhetorical or the content of a course is the first thing. Then the next thing to do is finding ways in which it can be integrated into assignments. So I love the paper that the paper that Anwar and I and Huberval did is so interesting, because the example that Huberval does is, to me, one of the perfect examples of, let's say, a clash of worldviews. It's around medicine and healthcare. And it's interesting because the gender division of healthcare, who does the feeling emotion labor are women, right? Who are in lower paid, overworked jobs as nurses and assistants. And then you've got the male doctors making the big salaries. They're in the hospital administrators in many cases, historically. So his work is so interesting because he's trying to build in, at the level of both translanguaging and at the level of the preparation of new doctors, the value of emotion and affect, the importance of it for the field of healthcare and healing. So 10 years ago, you probably you would have only seen that kind of introduction in the context of maybe naturopathic or homeopathic medicine. You wouldn't see it in the regular preparation of doctors. So that's interesting. And perhaps it's even more interesting in a context of international ed, where the lingua franca of medicine, so doctors are probably expected to have some level of English to be able to read the latest research, to publish their research, and to have access to the latest pharmaceutical studies. So right away, I mean, the history of medicine then is an expert model of technical pharmaceutical intervention, surgical intervention. Don't argue with the doctor is the boss, or when the doctor interviews you, it's not on a level of equivalence. It's the questions are being formed to reach in a sense, a formatted kind of outcome that leads to a predictable intervention. Yeah, so interesting. His example in that article is so good. And then also around citizenship, the example of the duoethnography that that Anwar used in my example of the issues analysis project of getting of how one of the students through that assignment was looking at the relationship of feeling emotion and the invisibility of people's history in the typical texts that we give to newcomers in Canada. So I don't know if there's what I would call it an emotion syllabus, but there are places and interactions where once we become aware and we validate it as a component of our courses and respect it as a component of our relationships in the university, then I think that's a really good place to start. But as I said at the very beginning, the learning outcomes for emotion, for all identity work, don't follow neatly in a linear, discrete accumulation of a 12-week or 14-week course. So the learning, it may be more long-term, if it comes at all.
I'm going to quote you in some papers later on, yeah? About this. I have here Elisa saying that this is also conversation in philosophy, yeah? Or trazendo is not legitimized as philosophy. Yeah? Other disciplines have been debating the role of oral traditions as well. Yeah, going back to the book. I believe Elisa Matos is also going to be quite interested in Armada's book as well, Brian. All right, so we are moving on now to question 6. That is about the connection between translanguaging, there was a misspelling here, between translanguaging and critical effect literacy. What should you say the connection is?
Well, I think there could be many examples. The example I gave with the bagel world is the trans semiotics, that translanguaging can bring different kinds of let's say elite, that's not the word I want, that translanguaging positions the speaker in different ways to the content that is being enunciated. So that comes, this interesting issue came up with from an article we brought into our paper by Haji Gopalan, where he talks about one of an indigenous respondent in the study had mentioned that his commitment to the proposition stated was less stronger in Portuguese than it was in Guarani, I think. I forget which exactly language. So that's an interesting thing. I have found also that talking to teachers, international teachers, when they do teacher ed, or multilingual teachers, is that their experiences. So I just read an interesting dissertation on LGBTQ teachers teaching English internationally, that there's certain content that they will teach in English they would never teach in another language. And so it's interesting, the movement between languages is also related to, maybe they say, the intensity of what the content might feel for them. And so it can be that there's certain things that a student or a teacher can't say in this language that they'll feel quite comfortable exploring in an analytical, distanced way in another language. So that's interesting. And then my example with a Bagel World is translanguaging as transsemiotics, that the mixing starts to get into the Charles Peircean idea of the firstness, the indexicality now of what's going on, but also of the symbolic competence. So the symbolic competence of sign of people using these kinds of trans-semiotic or trans-languaged texts are speaking to you at many levels. They might be like Anwar talks about. He says in Bangladesh, sometimes people slip into English as they're translanguaging to assert a kind of status. So it's not just it's an indexing a certain social class or prestige or elite status and trying to demean the interlocutor. So you can see these kinds of movements are not just informational. They can be identity claims, they can be claims to status, they can be to subvert a text, to assert an identity. So yeah, it's all can all be related to affective literacy at different levels. But again, the idea is that the same text will speak to different people and different groups at different times.
It's quite interesting to see your position on this, being a child who went to Hebrew schools, having this Ukrainian ancestrality. It's really interesting to see your position in that. Thank you, Brian. We are moving now into question 7, and from our group, we have only 2 more questions, and we are talking to our audience here. In question 7, we have, in the paper Feeling Our Way, you shared one of your students' perspective related to neutral or nothingness feelings towards indigenous people brought by some Canadian books. Recently in Brazil, this kind of neutrality led people to say that there was no slavery or no dictatorship here. Could more emphasis on affect in schools help awareness and empathy? What do you think?
Yeah, I think the example, Stephanie's example, was a real powerful one for me, is that you read the text and to see how it is kind of normalizing a certain historical perspective, as she said, where the reader feels nothing because that experience is invisible. So what do you do is interesting. I mean, in Stephanie's case, she did a workshop for new teachers to make them aware of it. The other thing you do, and it also depends on, so helping the teachers see these gaps is critical. The other thing is encouraging teachers to supplement the texts with other materials is also really important. So that becomes a key issue, because a lot of the times books are compulsory. School boards, institutions will pay for the books. They're not going to suddenly just hide them in a corner. They're going to use them. And then, so the art of the teacher putting in, let's say, counter texts or counter narratives to the one that exist are really important. And you see, especially in places like the United States, even in Canada, with this new kind of right-wing backlash against social justice movements. The prime example in the United States is now many of the United States are banning critical race theory. Though most of those politicians have no idea what it is. Doesn't matter. It's come to symbolize a political target for them. So what's interesting, if you're in that kind of position, what are the ways, what are the opportunities orally, or in the way you construct readings around text, which I've always been really interested. What are the study questions? What kinds of literacies do they encourage? Not only just information retrieval, but critical analysis, emotional analysis. How do you feel? How would certain groups feel? That can be built into how the text is taken up. So increasing teachers' awareness of strategies to supplement, mitigate, or even resist the dominant messages of the text, or pluralize the messages of the text are key. And yeah, so as Andrea's point, teaching in the gaps, exactly. Yeah, so I'm trying to remember who wrote read behind the lines, read between the lines. All those kinds of things are really good. And so to me, that's the essence of good critical language teacher education, is encouraging teachers to see what are the spaces in this setting, what am I required to do, what are the gaps, where can I challenge the singular dominant or invisible narratives that are present in this text. And there might be small spaces to do that, maybe even bigger ones.
Yeah, quite so. Thank you. Thank you for your thoughts on that. And Brian, our last question from our group is question 8, before we listen a little to our audiences. As you know, Brazil is a country with abysmal levels of economic inequality, with stratospheric differences in income distribution. So people are trapped in poverty with little chance to climb up the social ladder. The only way out is through education, or one of the only ways out. Yeah, people also have drug traffic here as an alternative, but the only way, the one of the most important ways out is education. However, such contrasts make a huge impact on many students who believe that school cannot do much for them, and on teachers who are struggling with the harsh conditions imposed by low investment in education and feel discouraged. So again, what would be the impact of critical affect literacy in such a scenario?
Well, it's like that other question that I was asked earlier about Freire. I think it would be Brazilians who read critical affect literacy would be the ones to say this, to what extent, if at all, that would address the kinds of situations you talked about. So, I mean, what I've seen at the public schools, that really are, the inequalities are far more severe in parts of Brazil than they are in Canada. Though I have to say, on some of the indigenous reservations in Canada, the schooling situation's bad too. So yeah, I'm not sure. That's a question that I'd love to hear from Brazilian colleagues. Would affect literacy, as we've talked about it, make any difference, or would that be seen as a ridiculous and ineffectual approach, that the real struggle is more at the political and larger organizational level of communities? Yeah, so I'm hesitant to say in these cases that education's going to change everything. There's always been, and especially from a conservative point of view, blaming the teacher when emancipation or liberation doesn't happen. So there was that famous movie Stand and Deliver, about how this teacher went into a horrible neighborhood of violence, drugs, poverty, and suddenly changed everybody. Was able to, and then just the heroic individual. So I worry about that kind of orientation, that there are limits to what schools can do. There are limits to what teachers can do. We have to be aware of that. At the same time, there can be small moments of impact and hope that can be done. But I'm reluctant to say teachers can solve these problems on their own. And I'm also hesitant to say to what extent this critical affective literacy is relevant in the settings that the question provider has described. I mean, I would love to hear from colleagues what they think about that. Is that a dimension that would improve the kind of indifference or the belief that schooling has failed? Schooling will not overcome the harsh inequalities that are going on in Brazil.
Yeah. And you see, we have this sort of wide disbelief in education here, yeah. And so when it comes to reinforcing students' self-esteem or students' willingness to believe themselves, we must act on that. We need to go to work from the basis. Of course, we don't have only education, as I mentioned. It was quite a joke, but we have traffic. But we have many people, especially in our fields, Brian, languages in general, modern languages. We have many students who get their formation and then they go to trade, commerce. Many of our students. We have sort of a small percentage of our students who follow the career. But anyway, this quite discouraging environment where education is seen, not only education, the country imposes, or the country policy imposes this idea of if you are from an oppressed class, you die oppressed. So there is no way to climb out. There is no way to escape. There is no way out of poverty, of the situation. So I believe as you that there are limits for what we can do, of course. But then we must go step by step, yeah? we can't just quit because of that. And then we try. I believe affect helps a lot. If we try to enhance or to empower our students, to help them understand they can change. So until we get a change of paradigm, let's use Thomas Mann here, yeah, it's a long way, but we must go step by step. I believe that. Thank you for your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I agree too. Yeah. Yeah, and I think ideas of hope and optimism are really important. So if that can be instilled or as part of the relationships between teachers and students, that's really important.
Yeah, so that's it. And Brian, we're almost running out of time. Now, we usually end here in Brazilian time around midday and something. So I'm going to read to you some of the comments we had in our chat from our audience, and then we are going to be through. Okay, so Tamara wrote, thinking about the global South as an epistemological construct, the affectivity between different social linguistic backgrounds in the language teaching learning process is a challenge. I think Tamara had finished this. Let me just check the continuation. So, how to deal with this challenge in a more humanitarian way, considering the elitism already imposed by colonialism?
So I completely agree with Tamara. It reminds me again, going back to I was talking about that experience of editing my mom's book, of just being open to a broader set of epistemological ways of expressing meaning. And one's encountered a kind of elitist literacies that tend to predominate in the teaching of language. So value other kinds of forms of meaning making, experiences of meaning making, attachment to those forms of meaning making. Going back again to my own experience, I was talking about faith-based literacies and other literacies. So yeah, so I think that's a key aspect of that, is being open to alternative forms of meaning making and being ready to critique the critique. So also pluralizing the oppositional voices that claim to speak for the global South and for decoloniality, because there are also hierarchies. It goes back to what I was saying about the non-reciprocal nature of disciplinary knowledge. So that's the other thing, is look critically upon who is claiming to speak for the global South or decolonial practices.
Completely agree. Thank you very much, Brian. Valkyria, hello. Valkyria, Brian, I still love to have a sabbatical to study with you and Andrea about post-memory, duoethnography, and the relationship with critical citizenship. Hope this time will come someday.
Oh, I totally agree. Yeah, no.
I want to join the group, Valkyria.
Well, it's having spent time with both of them and learning, they really create relationships with students that are, because I've had Valkyria students and I've had the pleasure of being in Andrea Matos' class and meeting her students. They have the real art of the interpersonal relationships that, I can just like feel the aura in the room. So I love to suck up that kind of wisdom, that interpersonal affective wisdom that they have. So yeah, that'd be great. Or maybe we can meet somewhere halfway.
Yeah.
I can get out of Toronto finally. It's been a long time.
The idea about halfway is interesting, Brian. But I believe you are very much required, and you'll be very much invited here in Brazil. So all over the country. Okay, so let me see. We have some more comments, from lots of comments from the audience saying how much they appreciated listening to you. Yeah, let me see if we can have some here. I'm checking over there in the YouTube. By the way, thank you very much for being here with us. You who are watching us online, and the ones who are watching us later. Yeah, it's been really a pleasure to have you and to interact with you guys. We had lots of comments saying, I agree with you, I couldn't agree more, I agree with you, beautiful talk, Brian, great talk, muito obrigado. So we have many thanks from the audience here. And so we came to the end of our colloquium. It's been a wonderful time here with you. So I'd like to thank you, Professor Brian Morgan, on behalf of GECAL and of Proformação. Thank you very much for your kindness in sharing with us all these experiences and all this food for thought you brought this morning. It was a delightful time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. I really appreciate it. Obrigado a todos e todas. So that was really nice, the invitation. Thank you again.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you, Brian, very much for sharing with us your time and especially your thoughts. Was so good. You have a lot of work to do in our group. It's a harder social challenge for us as been teaching in Brazil. But I really appreciate your comments here and how you can help us with your papers and with your ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We are so close, so near each other, and but here was my pleasure to have you in the Proformação channel and with GCAL group too, as a member of group. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Brian, it's an honor for us to have the opportunity to interact with you. Your academic journey inspired us to develop the colonial research and critical linguistics. In short time, I'm sure that you have the opportunity to interact with you face to face and consider the University of Brasilia the extension of your house.
Oh,
You
wow.
have a lot of people in our group. I admire your trajectory, your academic journey, and you inspired us to continue to transform our society. It is so important. Thank you very much this opportunity to interact with you. It's an honor for us.
Well, the inspiration is always mutual. I have such a wonderful time, and I learned a lot from doing these kinds of things and getting to talk to my Brazilian colleagues. So thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you. It was wonderful. It's amazing.
Katja, your mic's off. Your microphone's off.
Yeah.
I said I also would like to thank Simone. She was in the backstage here working for us,
Yeah.
since the beginning. Thank you, Simone, for your great job.
Yeah, it was wonderful, Simone. Thank you a bunch.
Thank you, Nilda. Bye-bye.
Nilda, thank you so much for the interview.
Thank you. My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Something about Gilac and Celine before you finish? Okay.
Ok. Ok. Então, eu queria aproveitar a oportunidade para convidar os colegas que desejarem participar do nosso evento. No mês de julho, nós vamos ter a nossa terceira Conferência Internacional de Uso da Linguagem e a terceira Jornada Internacional de Linguística da Crítica. Será feito um evento pela Universidade de Brasília, pelo nosso grupo de pesquisa, e você que está nos assistindo agora desejar participar, é só acessar esse link que você vai ter acesso a toda a programação. E aí, por ser no mês de julho, nós não vamos ter, né, Kátia, um colóquio, que nós estamos tendo agora, vai ser o nosso evento. E aí, no mês de agosto, nós vamos justamente ter o 14º colóquio, e nós convidamos a professora Vilma Favorito, do INES, e a professora Ivani Silva, da Unicamp, para nós conversarmos um pouquinho sobre educação bilíngue para surdos e sobre políticas linguísticas. Aí vai ser um prazer contar com a presença de vocês.
Ok. Nos veremos, então, no Gilac e em agosto.
Isso,
agora,
vai ser um prazer.
Tchauzinho, de verdade.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, thank you.
Bye-bye. Have a nice day, Brian.
Thank you very much.
Brian.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Tchau, tchau.